All right. Welcome everyone who's joining us on the Major Taylor Iron Rider Winter Webinar Series. We are coming to you not so live. We're doing pre-recorded because we have so many amazing topics that we want to cover this season. And one of them happens to be a very popular one with the pandemic that has happened. There's been an incredible surge of new cyclists on the road in all of our communities throughout the country, if not the world. And one of the most important topics that have come about is bike advocacy. And today, this evening, we happen to have two of the heavy hitters joining us from their respective clubs. We have Catherine Grivis.
Grivis.
We have Catherine Grivis. She's coming all the way from the original founding Major Taylor Club in Columbus, Ohio. She's joining us, and she's a huge advocate in her community. And we also have Randall Bivens, Major Taylor Cycling Club of Virginia. He is a treasurer in his respective club, and he also brings a lot of information and his expertise and knowledge to the topic at hand. So I'd like to welcome you both. And personally, I would like to thank you for volunteering to support the series that we have going. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks for your leadership.
You're welcome. And before I even forget, I need to introduce myself. I am Derica Hendon Barnes. I'm the president of Major Taylor Iron Riders in New York City. And we are presenting this series for all the clubs nationwide as we continue to go on through this pandemic that is wrecking our lives and our season. But we're going to make the best of it. So that's it. So I'll give you guys a platform to let you guys take it from here for all of our listeners and watchers.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're both very excited to be here with y'all talking about how to create safer streets and how to be safe with the existing streets we have. I'm going to talk a little bit about advocacy, and Randall's going to talk with us about how to stay safe riding under current conditions. So if you are somebody who feels, well, let me say this, about 60% of the population has said that they are interested in using a bike to get someplace they might normally travel by car. Clearly, 60% of the population is not currently doing that. And overwhelmingly, when people are asked why they don't use a bike for transportation, the big reason is safety. And the truth is that when you look comparatively at various modes of transportation, biking actually is, relatively speaking, a very safe mode of transportation. And when you factor in the benefits of using a bike for transportation, the way in which it can interrupt chronic diseases related to physical inactivity, biking is a great way to travel. But the truth is that roads, no matter how you're traveling, whether you are riding a bike or walking or using a bus or traveling in a car, we are seeing increases in crashes and serious injuries and fatalities for all modes of transportation. There's an interesting research study, a longitudinal research study that came out one of the universities a couple years ago that looked at, I think, 13 different communities and looked at bike infrastructure. And one of the fascinating things that came out of that study was that when you create safe passage for people who are using bikes for transportation, roads are not only safer for people using bikes and for people walking, it actually turns out you see reductions in serious injuries and fatalities for people driving. So focusing on creating safe communities for people who are moving from one place to another by bike is a really good thing, not just for those of us who ride, but for, as it turns out, everyone in our communities. So thinking about how to advocate for those things is just really important. One thing to think about in all of our communities, even some of the best bike-friendly communities like Minneapolis, Detroit is a great biking community. They're great biking. There are, comparatively speaking, great biking communities around the country. But even in some of the better communities, we're it's still not great for everyone to travel. Like, would you feel comfortable with your 8-year-old child traveling in a corridor? If the answer is no, then you do not have a comfortable bike network. Would you feel comfortable with your 80-year-old mother traveling in a corridor? If the answer is no, then there's work to be done to create safe bike networks. And so thinking about how we advocate for good road design, and not just for good design, like there's this way in which we're often asked, like, you know, what does good design look like? The truth is, transportation professionals know what good road design looks like. They know how to design roads so that it's safe for travelers. But there's a lot of pressure to continue to design in the way that we have designed since the rise of the automobile, and to continue to follow practices that have been proven wrong. For example, there's lots of conversation about when congestion happens, we need to add more lanes, more travel lanes. But what the research clearly shows is adding travel lanes does not reduce congestion over the long run. It induces demand. It invites more people to travel by car. And so lots of the strategies that we have followed to design roads just don't work. It's not only that they don't work for those of us who are biking, they don't work for anyone. And so if we want to create communities that work for all of us, we really have to follow some of the proven strategies around calming traffic, slowing things down, really separating the roads that are fast, like our freeways, and the roads that are meant for commerce and for residential, so that speeds are more reasonable. And we have to remember that roads are publicly owned right of way. Like, that is one of the biggest assets that we communally own as you know, a collective, is that real estate that that currently is primarily thought about for moving cars quickly from A to B, or storing cars in the form of on-street parking. That's collective right-of-way. And in lots of our communities, there are people who need to use a bike or walk out of necessity. I know that's how I came to biking. I couldn't afford for a 10-year period to own, operate, and maintain a car. Like, if I needed to get someplace, I was walking, I was taking a bus, or I was biking. And biking is the quickest way to get from A to B in my community. And that's not a unique story. There are plenty of people in our communities that whose lives could be better if they felt safe moving from one place to another by bike.
I feel it's the same way in New York City as well. Very commutable city.
Yeah. I mean, New York is a really great example of, there's this annual race where people will start using various modes of transportation, and like, who wins if you're going from A to B, and it's always the bike, right?
Yes, always.
Yeah. So, you know, thinking about how, you know, the other thing that's great about traveling by bike is, like, what community do you not fall in love with traveling at the speed of bike? It's so much faster than walking, and it's appropriately slow enough that you actually get to notice your surroundings. You actually get to have conversations with people at a stop sign, or at when I'm at a light and there's somebody at a bus stop. If I've got my bike decorated in some way, they're going to say something to me. Or if I'm in a skirt and a pair of heels, like, we're probably going to have a conversation. It's
true.
a very human way to travel and to be in place and to notice the architecture and the murals and the delicious smells and the kind of gross smells and just like
The
everything
community.
about being in a place. Yeah.
Yeah, I can definitely attribute that when I started riding my bike in New York, I really got to know the city from a ground level as opposed to on the subway. Like I know the corners, I know the shortcuts, I know the side streets, the one-way streets. I really got to know New York City when I started riding my bike. So I agree.
Yeah, when I grew up in LA, spent 30 years of my life in Los Angeles in various sports, traveling through all the counties, Orange County, Los Angeles County, and a lot of that I did by car. Now I relocated some years ago, some 20 years ago, but now when I go back to ride, and these guys, I didn't know they were there, but when they take me out to ride, I see things that I never saw by car. And that's the amazing part of going back. Now, granted, the city's changed a lot also, but some of the things that have been planted there for years that I really didn't notice by car.
Yeah. I think one part is like advocating for good street design, but part of advocating for good street design is trying to influence the public conversation that happens around bikes. Whether that conversation is about how bikes are reported on in the paper, how people who ride bikes are thought about in a workplace, or even like how our loved ones interact with us when they know we're going to be on a bike going from one place to another. And you know, particularly women are often, I don't know if you've had this experience, Derica, where if you're taken off to go someplace alone and somebody realizes you're going to be on a bike, they're like, oh, can I give you a ride? Like, is this?
You're going where?
It's this
On
very
what?
well-intentioned, loving gesture that also communicates like, I don't feel good about what you are about to do. Like,
Yeah,
I am nervous about your safety in the world.
Yes, commuting to work. You ride a bike to work? Yeah, I get that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just have a quick question. I mean, although I live in New York and they have the best infrastructure for cyclists, sometimes even in the city, you know, riding with the cabs and the crazy tourists and the drivers. You know, how does somebody go about, like, if they don't have an infrastructure, if they don't have the bike lanes, they just don't have the infrastructure, like, how do they go about starting their conversations? Like, where do they begin?
And that's where you go out to find your local advocacy groups. There's several here in the Virginia area, and you just have to get involved a little bit and find the meetings and hear what's going on. Then you start going to your local municipalities and raising the concerns for these areas, especially in developing areas. If you get on early, then they can start looking at planning something for those areas. As the areas start to grow, they start doing the planning and the easements that they can make available, especially for touring type areas, and not only cycling, but walking and those type of trails as well. Getting from point A to point B safely is what they really look at. But you really have to do your research. American League of Bicyclists are one of those that myself and Catherine are members of. We're what they call LCI League certified instructors, where we go into the training of the safety aspects, and there's the side of the advocacy and getting involved in bringing more traffic lanes for cycling and biking to the areas.
We're also in this great moment in history where, you know, we are about to have, perhaps by the time this airs, we will have a new transportation secretary nationally. And if it is, you know, who President Biden is proposing, you know, hopefully we have Secretary Buttigieg, and he does some of the things that Secretary Fox did under the Obama administration and really prioritizes, you know, bike travel and in particular safety travel. But even if that's not done, like even under more conservative administrations, local funding streams that flow from the federal government through the states into the metropolitan planning organizations, some of those dollars are have to be spent on transportation alternatives that improve air quality. Most metropolitan planning organizations through their funding cycles have requirements to think about bike transportation. But oftentimes, if advocates aren't in the room, people tend to do what they are familiar with, what they have historically done. And so, what Randall says, like, it is really important to figure out what's happening in your local community and plug into that.
I agree. When you mentioned the League of American Bicyclists, I think you said it's an LCI. Can you
Yes.
speak a little bit more of that? Is that something that an individual would have to search out themselves, or is there a representative in each state or city or metropolitan city, or how does that work?
They're pretty much all over the place. I actually came in I got invited by a member who was looking to bring more certified instructors into the Prince William County area. With the community and the growth of cycling and how the funds are spent, because like Catherine said, if you're not there, they'll put up one little strip for cycling and call it a day if nobody's there to advocate to get more put in where that money's put to good use. And then also you can go in and train people who are uncomfortable with cycling. Some people haven't been on a bike in 30 years, or you may get some children who are learning to ride a bicycle for the first time. So there's skill sets that you work on for handling, braking, and awareness that the classroom atmosphere teaches you to represent to a future cyclist.
Good information. You guys kind of cut out on me a little bit there, so I may have missed the beginning part of it. You were frozen, but we're going to work it out.
Well, and one thing that's really important when you're riding, and both Randall and I have been taught this, is it's really important to be visible and predictable. Sometimes our gut tells us we need to be at the edge of the road where we're not in anybody's way and we're not making anybody mad. But that's a dangerous place to be, actually, when you're riding. And it can be counterintuitive, but the faster a road is moving, the more important it is that you are in a visible and predictable position. Because if I'm standing still and looking straight ahead and I put my hands out and I'm wiggling my fingers, like, for me, it's like right here. This is where my peripheral vision tells me that my fingers are wiggling. That's being still. The faster I move, the tighter that vision cone becomes. So on a fast moving road, it's really important, if you are traveling a road like that, to be in a position where you can be seen, where you can be visible, and where, being predictable is about not dodging in and out of cars or being in a place where you're not going to continually run into debris or other potholes, and be somebody who is just, you're dodging things that you can see, but the driver behind you can't see those things. They just see somebody who looks like a little kid flying all over the place, and they're anxious about, like, what is this person doing? That's when the honking and the yelling comes in. So it can be counterintuitive, but to be in a position where you are seen, where you are visible and predictable, is the safest place for you to be. It doesn't mean that somebody's not going to yell at you, but they're probably going to give you 3 feet while they pass and yell at you, because at the end of the day, nobody wants to have body work done to their car.
No.
They do not want to hit you.
Yeah,
That
and
is
Jerica,
true.
recently on social media, there's been a big explosion of COVID cyclists who've come into cycling because of COVID. Um, and you read some of the headlines on the social media, I'm about to do my first century, and you realize that they haven't been riding for a long time. And there are certain things that go into cycling that you need to be aware of. And one of them is knowing your route. And just like Catherine stated, being visible, whether it's on a trail or whether it's in the streets, you want to make sure you know what the traffic is like during the time of day you're going to be riding. That's very important because sometimes you may need to find an alternate route with your comfortability with riding in traffic or on trails. Some of the trails ride in opposite direction. So as a cyclist, if you're riding on a trail in opposite direction, you have to think about, as I'm going across this intersection, is there a car turning left from the opposite side of the street, not seeing me as I go across? You kind of have to keep those things in the back of your mind. Or as you're approaching a car at that same intersection going in the opposite direction, that car is looking left to turn right. You have to make sure that that car sees you before you pull out in front of it. And one of the easiest ways to make sure that you want a car to go in front of you is just take your hands off the handlebars. If you're at a stop sign, a four-way, three-way stop, and you don't feel comfortable with that driver pulling off in front of you or pulling off behind you, just take your hands off the handlebar at the stop. And that driver will see that, okay, that person's not going to drive off. I'll pull off in front of them.
That's such a simple idea that, I never would have considered. You just do the typical way, like you go first. But that is something that I can even actually use going forward, because you never know when you're at a four-way intersection that does not have a light, a signal, that they're looking at you, they don't want to go, and people start inching up. And oddly enough, that actually happened to me. I was at a four-way intersection, and I was going to go straight, and the driver didn't know if I was going to go, and I'm looking, and she's looking at me, and so I slowly rolled out, and she slowly rolled out. It was a slow motion collision, if you will. But I saw it coming. Yeah. She looked at me, and it was just like bumped into the car, and I fell down, and she was horrified. I was like, how did I let that happen? Like, It was slow motion. So I think throwing up the hands is a great idea, just to alert the driver that you're not going to go anywhere, that you have the right of way.
Yes, and on Catherine's vision, peripheral vision, I kind of ride with the mirror, and I feel uncomfortable without it because I'm constantly looking in my mirror. I do more road riding than I do trails. And some of the things I'm paying attention to as I ride is how soon does the car see me in front of them as I'm riding? And one of those indicators is I'll see a blinker going left to go around me, and that'll be a good 300 to 400 yards. Yeah. But I will see cars wait until almost the last minute, which tells me they could be paying attention to something else in the car. Or trucks with mirrors or trailers. See, we get caught up, and we have to be careful about these electronic safety devices. I'm not an advocate of the radar. A lot of people love it. But what happens with the radar, what most people do, they hear it beep and they look down at the handlebars to see the beep. They don't know if it's a truck or a trailer with side mirrors. And that, to me, is
I'm sorry. I don't want to interrupt you, but can you just go explain a little bit like what's a radar? Is that something that's on the Garmin? I'm not aware of it. Is it on the Garmin, or is this another device?
Yeah, that's the Garmin Viera tail light. And what it does is it's a radar signal that gives a signal that there's a car behind you. And it could be another cyclist, but it will beep when a car gets within 200 yards of you or something like that. So I kind of see the cars coming probably before the radar goes off because I constantly glance. And with the mirrors being so small, you have to work at just looking at a glance and looking for lights and fenders and things like that. And that's what I do. But yeah, it's to each its own, and you have to ride and be comfortable with your ride. But knowing your route is very important.
I agree with you on that. And the mirror that you're referring to is the one that's on the helmet, like the side mirror for the helmet, or the handlebars.
I use it on the glass. And like I said, those are things you got to get comfortable with also. If I switch helmets, if it's glued to your helmet, you have to have multiple mirrors. So I use the one on my glasses. But somewhere, you got to get comfortable, whether it's on the handlebars, on the helmet, or on your glasses.
Okay. You definitely touched on some good individual safety things that cyclists could do, because even if you know everything, you've been riding for years and years, you can always use a refresher on some new technology like radar, like you just mentioned, could be out there for some of the cyclists that are aging cyclists that may not have that capability of looking over their shoulder. They just want to hear a beep or tune or have the mirror. And just being aware of your surroundings is absolutely clutch, because we all ride on roads where there's traffic all the time. So I couldn't agree with you more. Is there any other? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Catherine.
Communicating confidence too, like being predictable is part of communicating confidence, and just following traffic laws. It is not unusual in my experience when I'm riding on the road for somebody who's driving to say, "Oh, you go ahead," and when they have right of way. And as much as I appreciate the politeness that they're trying to offer, like, I'm not sure that the car coming up behind you knows why you're stopping and isn't going to go around you, or if there are multiple lanes, if somebody's not going to see, like, let's all just follow the rules, because then we know what's going on. And so just being really clear about your space and about your, it's not being militant, it's not being rude, it's just part of the responsibility of being on the road and following the expectations of what we have to do on the road. Every state in the United States, bikes are allowed on the road, and in some, and from there it varies. Like, are you allowed on the sidewalk or not? If there's bike infrastructure, do you have to be in it? Like, that stuff varies from state to state. So just knowing where I am, Ohio, one of the things that we have to be really careful about is in lots of states, the roadway is defined as like where the asphalt is, like from one edge to the other. But in Ohio, it's, the white line that's on the edge, the fog line. Roadway is designed is designated as basically fog line to fog line. So if somebody's riding on the berm on the other side of the fog line, you are in Ohio, you are no longer a vehicle. You are now a pedestrian, which there are very different right-of-way rules. If a crash were to happen, you have very different responsibilities around yielding. And so just knowing what the laws in your community are is really important. My guess is most law enforcement does not know what the laws are. So it's really helpful for you to know what the laws are. In my community, our advocacy group, when they print membership cards, there's a Ohio Revised Code 4511.55C is printed on the back, which is like basically, it's this paragraph of straight from the Ohio Revised Code. You don't have to be on the edge of the road. And in these conditions, particularly, it would be a mistake to be on the edge of the road. That is a useful card to carry if law enforcement pulls you over and says, "Hey, I want you to be over there." Now, at the end of the day, I'm not going to argue with somebody who has a gun, but I will take a stab at, here's what I think Ohio Revised Code says, and if you need to ticket me, you should do that. I can go fight it in court, and win. But yeah, that it can be useful to know what the law in your state is as it relates to cyclists' rights on the road. There's just a lot of confusion about it.
And to add on to your knowing the traffic laws, even on the trails, there are some commuters who ride on the trails, or even folks riding to work who are, well, let's say more commuters, because early in the mornings, there's a lot of people in cars trying to get to and from work. And there's times when they're running late. It's not our fault that they're running late, but we have to obey the signs that are out there. So when there's a stop sign, there's a white line for cyclists as well. And I've seen plenty of cyclists pull up to the curb of a busy street and decide to stop. Well, most of those times, those people are running late in cars and they don't really want to stop for a cyclist. So there's a good chance that you pulling up to the curb to stop versus the white line could cause a car to slam on its brakes and that other car behind it not see that they're going to stop either and plow right into the back of them. So those are some of the things we got to think of as cyclists also. Obey the traffic signs. If the stop sign is back here, stop at the stop sign and wait until it's safe to pass.
Yeah, I think there's hundreds of thousands of cyclists that we're all guilty of running the red light, or the stop sign, and God forbid if we're in a hot ride and people just like, I can't stop, I got to get ahead of this guy. We don't make smart decisions. So I think many of us have been accused of that.
Well, the research says that that cyclists tend to be slightly more lawful than drivers. That the predictor is, what are the norms in your community? If your community is highly lawful in its travel behaviors, then whatever mode you're using, you're probably highly lawful. If your community is full of scofflaws, then whatever mode you're using. When I'm riding in New York, when I'm driving in New York, it's like all bets are off where the lane is, or whether we're going to pull over for the ambulance, or whether, the light is a recommendation,
We draft on the ambulance. That's like a freebie right there. Are you kidding me? Come on.
That's like motorist or cyclist. Like that's not about the mode. That's about what's the culture of how we feel about traffic laws in our community, right? So
may the best man get there first.
Yeah, don't let anybody paint you with cyclists are scofflaws. It's just not true. The research is pretty clear on that. We are actually slightly more lawful than drivers.
Slightly.
Yeah.
Slightly.
So we got a little bit more to lose, right? So we're paying attention.
Randy?
And knowing your route, as an avid cyclist or professional recreational cyclist, as some folks, we go back to planning those 100-mile rides. Knowing where the restrooms are, where your refreshments are, how much food did I bring with me, my water. You have to plan this all out. It's kind of hard to just go out there and ride, and you can make it unsafe for yourself if you think that, wow, it's about 50 degrees and I'm gonna do 100 miles, 150 miles, and I didn't plan on where I'm going to stop to get refreshments. You can actually get dehydrated in 50-degree weather if you're not careful. So those are the things we have to look at planning when we plan knowing our routes. Along the trails, where are the restrooms? Am I okay with the porta potty or a public restroom? Did I plan to stop at a market or a AM, PM, 7-Eleven type store? And some of the things that I do also is I have the membership cards where you get the discount when you make purchases. So it comes in handy if you go to a 7-Eleven and you just happen to get a bottle of water free every now and then because of the purchases that you make along the route. So nutrition is a good part of what did I pack for eating every half hour, every hour for a long distance ride, or should I have to stop for a restroom? Where will I stop along my route? And also weather plays a role. If the weather gets bad, is there an alternate safer route that I can take? Because riding in bad weather on a bicycle is probably twice as bad as being in a car, and you don't want to rely on a car and you can't control your vehicle. So, know your route, pre-drive it, take a half a trip here on a day of the time that you're going to be riding. That way you know what the traffic's going to be like, or even on trails, how busy are the trails? Because our trails here in Virginia, we have skaters, we have strollers, we have runners, and I'd say 9 times out of 10, they're going to ride straight, but you'll get that 1 out of 10 that person just decides to turn around in the middle of a path. They didn't decide to go to the corner. They're just turning around in front of you and didn't look. Or they have headphones in their ear, so on your left doesn't do much good because they couldn't hear you in the first place.
Or they're a toddler. Like, who knows what a toddler or a squirrel or a dog is going to do?
Yes.
No one. No one knows. They're so unpredictable.
Trails are not the place to ride fast either. Like trails are the place to if you're doing 15 miles or more an hour, just move to the road. It's not, unless you know there's nobody out. Lots of trails are marked with speed limits. Now enforcement tends not to be strong, but if you've got an active trail like Randy talked about, like you just don't want to tangle with a dog leash or a toddler. It's not good for you. It's not good for them.
Yeah,
just
I
move
agree.
it.
I agree.
Well, what's interesting also is talking to people on the trails who don't wear helmets. And being an active trail at dawn and dusk is an active time for the deer. And that's not a time you really want to get hit by a 200-pound deer and get knocked over. Or we've seen cyclists go down a hill and one going up a hill, and their handlebars happen to cross. So a lot of people think that I'll be safe. I'm not going that fast on a bicycle. I don't need a helmet. But they don't think about somebody else's recklessness or an animal that's 200 pounds crossing their path.
Good points. So, Randy, you had mentioned something about a little while ago about the bike lanes, like creating the routes, knowing your route. And I know that, you know, for some of the listeners that are going to be watching this, they're in, like you said, those rural areas. Like, how do you create your routes? Like, how do the routes get created? Like, how do you get the infrastructure created? Like, do you have to go and do that to the Department of Transportation, or can you have input on, we want a bike route to go along this park because our kids are there? We can go, you know, the service road alongside the highway. Like, how do you get the routes created?
A lot of that is done by logistics with the community, how the community is being built, the schools, the neighborhoods, and they kind of through census data also, what the age of the children in that area. When I plan my routes, I kind of look at Strava heat maps, and it will show the most traveled routes by cyclists. And I kind of look at that as, wow, if this is a very hot route, I can plan something around all these hot lanes where cars are familiar with cyclists, seeing how hot it is. But the communities kind of look at some data that they capture, and I think it's some Google data, or there's some other metrics that they use, but they don't use the Strava heat maps, but they are using some data to identify what's an ideal location for cycling, along with the community and how the community is built.
Organizations like Adventure Cycling also play a big role, particularly in rural communities, in thinking about, there's a US bikeway system that's being built, like similar to the interstate system that Adventure Cycling is working with departments of transportations across the United States to help build these longer routes across states and crossing state lines. Rail to trail organizations, like there's the big trail that's from Washington, DC to Washington State that has been proposed and is being built out. So getting involved in advocacy efforts to help influence where that stuff goes. And, you know, just talking to your people and talking to, you know, writing letters to the editor and talking to your elected officials, and figuring out how to tell the persuasive story. Like, most people know bikes are great for health and fitness. Lots of people have stereotypes about who rides a bike and who, you know, what motivates them. And so thinking about, you know, who you're trying to persuade and what's going to motivate that person. If somebody's perception is, you know, bikes are for rich old white guys and they're using my road as their gym, like, you don't want to send an older kidded guy to talk to that person, right? You want to send the mom with the, you know, the basket, somebody who like reminds them of somebody they care about.
So true. So true.
To break that stereotype of, oh, wait, like I didn't think of this person. I didn't think of, so if I'm talking to a politician who really cares about economic development and most politicians I know, local politicians, really care about economic development, then I'm not telling them the health story. I'm telling them the story that New York, for example, did, such great research around when you build roads that are welcoming to people on bikes, what you see is increases in sales tax revenues in the small businesses along those roads.
Yes.
People on bikes spend money in corridors where they are welcomed. We fuel differently than a car. We eat ice cream and delicious hamburgers and French fries and a beer here and there. And those dollars are much closer to communities and than oil is. And they employ a lot more people in our communities. We are appreciative of, places that are bike friendly and will let us refill our water bottles and, go to the bathroom. Like, I probably don't need another coffee mug, but if that's what you're selling and you let me use the bathroom, then I'm buying a coffee mug.
I'll buy
Like,
it. Another one.
We are, and if we're using it particularly as transportation, we may have more disposable income because we have our travel expenses are lower. If we don't have to worry about all of the maintenance that goes with a car, or if we can live in a car light or car free household, we may have a different income. And so that's the story I want to tell to somebody who really cares about economic development. How do we translate our stories into the things that whoever we're trying to persuade care about?
You touched on so many different good points, Catherine. You too, Randy. Like one in particular, when you said they're building out the bikeways, it was announced a couple weeks ago, I think. Perhaps I think it's completed. The bikeway from New York City to Toronto. It's about 700 miles, I think, Randy, or something insane.
Yes. Well, and that goes from Maine down to Florida, though, right? Toronto.
The portion that's in.
Yes, from Toronto
New
down
York
to. Yes, and then also it goes down from Maine down to Florida, right?
I didn't hear about that leg, but my God.
There's a couple of them. Yes, there's a couple of them, and then I think there's another one that Catherine just mentioned that's going across the country that they're proposing.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting because I know of a couple that they actually done a cross-country trip on the northern route, but it was along the highways when they were doing. I thought they were insane to do this, but
yes, I do too. I do too.
They did it. They rode maybe 50, 60 miles a day. They took a couple months off. It was a husband and wife thing as a fundraiser. If I remember correctly, they did it. But I guess they can do it now, and they can be on a bikeway. So I think it's great that they have that. But the one from New York City to Toronto, I think it was just open, and I was thinking that would be great to do, but just a small part of it, I would suspect.
Yeah, one is the East Coast Greenway. The East Coast Greenway, I believe, goes from Maine to Florida. And let's take a look and see if we can find the one from New York to Toronto.
Someone's going to do it. I'm sure somebody's going to do it, once the world opens up again. But
well, in the Greater Allegheny Passage from Pittsburgh to DC, and I guess that's the Greater Allegheny Passage and the C&O.
Yeah.
Like I rode that for the first time. I've only ridden the Greater Allegheny Passage, so half of it. But I was just shocked at just how beautiful it was and how well designed it was for people, for those of us who are biking, just the thoughtfulness of these trail towns where I needed to refill a water bottle or get something to eat or use the bathroom, like it had really been thought through.
I think it's great. I think there's the surge of cyclists on the road last year during the pandemic. It really tilted the scales in our favor to where they saw how many people were on the bikes, not because they were afraid to get on the subways like people in the northeastern area, but we have nothing else to do. Let me get a bike,
Right.
let me go out and ride. And those same people that got a bike are in those positions of power where they can create the infrastructure. And now that they see that we're not just crazy cyclists wanting to ride our bikes, it started to tip the scales in our favor. I think it's going to work more to our advantage as the years go along. We're going to start seeing more infrastructure for us. I'm super excited about it. So let's keep these people on the road.
Well, and it's this virtuous cycle, right? Like once you've done something that seemed crazy. I remember the first time I rode 7 miles, I was like, this is ridiculous. I can't believe I rode this far. I feel so powerful. And, then my first century, which was only like, I've been biking as an adult for the last 15 years, but my first century wasn't until about 3 or 4 years ago. But I finished that century and came home and said to my son, like, it turns out I can ride 100 miles. We need to go someplace. And like, I was like, I can't believe I can do this. Let's ride someplace. And within a month, he and I rode from, our house in Columbus, Ohio, to Parkersburg, West Virginia over a couple-day period, spent a night, turned around and rode back, which, 6 weeks before that would have been the most outrageous thing you could have told me that I would want to do. But there is something that's just like, like you said, Randy, like things you would never see otherwise. And just the adrenaline and the just feeling of, I don't know, like, wow, I'm a badass. Like that
Freedom.
sort of, yes.
Freedom.
And so all these people who are out discovering like that little taste of freedom. I've got a friend who I met a few years ago. He's in his 80s. He had not been on a bike since he was a kid, and he had double knee replacement. They put him on a trainer as part of his rehab, and he enjoyed it so much that he's like, oh, well, I'll just bike around my neighborhood. And I met him 5 years after his double knee rehab. And he said he has biked every day since then because he feels like he's 11 years old again. He's not biking fast. He's not biking far, but he rides every day because, yeah.
Freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom.
Freedom.
That's exactly what it is. When you were 11 years old, you can go all over the neighborhood and go to the neighborhood store and to the park and the basketball courts and the playground on your bike. So I can totally identify with him with the freedom. I get it. And you leave everything behind. You just ride your bike. That's great.
I don't know anyone who's excited to get in a car to go someplace. Like it's useful. Like if I need to get there, like, okay, it'll get me there quicker. But when you talk to people about getting on a bike, like they smile, like, oh yeah, that'll be fun.
Yeah, they really do. And go ahead, Randy.
I think about being 50, 60, 70, 100 miles out. And I'm like, will I really be here if I was in my car? And the question is, I would have to be going somewhere. But on a bike, you just go and do it and you realize, wow, look how far I've ridden. And I wouldn't have been here unless I was going to a certain destination.
That's true. And the mileage doesn't seem that bad. It's like, it was only a 40-mile day. Well, you went over, right? Yeah, that's only 30 miles. My friends are like, you did what? But it was just a cool down
when
ride.
You look at it, I kind of, in the planning of your routes, if you're doing a volunteer or a fundraiser for an organization, their routes are pretty much going to have a 20-mile rest stop. And if you do it every 20 miles, you're thinking maybe I'm going to ride for an hour, hour and a half, maybe hour and 45 minutes, depending on your speed. And then I'm going to take a break. And then as you planned your route, this is where I would be at that 7-Eleven, at Wawa or the Sheets, where I can get refreshments or something like that.
So
and then it gets you going again for another 20 miles.
Yeah, it's so true. Your mentality changes about your capabilities. I will say that. Like my capabilities definitely changed after I did like you, Catherine, my first 7, my first 50, 75, 100, my first 120-mile ride to Montauk. I'm like, there is nothing that I can't do on this bike. It had only expanded when I did my first Ironman. I'm like, who needs 100 miles? I can do that in my sleep. So I get it. I get it.
I hear Derica getting ready to ride across the country. Do you hear that, Randy? Because I kind of hear that.
No, I think she's on me. That's a little bit out there.
I can get you to 140.6 miles. After that, I don't know what's going to happen. That's my cutoff point. 140.6. That's my cutoff.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else you guys want to cover before we close out
Well,
here?
bike check. Before you
Yes.
get on your bike, there's certain things you need to do. And depending on how long your ride is, you want to check your tires, make sure they're not worn. A lot of people will get out there and get on the road and your hands might be too cold because of the weather. Sometimes you may want to do your bike check the night before or in the morning. Check for the air pressure, check for the spokes, check your bike mechanics, the chain ring and cassettes, and also your brakes. Maybe you have multiple sets of rims and they're different widths. So if you ended up rotating your rims out, you may have to adjust your brake levers so that they don't, you want to have a little a space in between your bike calipers, or not your calipers, but your brake levers. You don't want your brake lever to come all the way to the handlebar, because that way you may not have any more to give to stop. You want to make sure that it doesn't come all the way up because you switched out your rims and your rims are a little smaller than the other rims that you're typically riding on. So those are some of the things you want to do before you get out and ride to make sure that you're going to have a safe ride.
Quick release too. I've seen people just like be in a hurry,
Yes.
putting their wheel back on their bike and just forget to tighten the quick release, and you hit a bump and that comes loose from the fork and you're in trouble.
I agree.
Make sure your helmet covers your forehead. We see a lot of helmets because the hair is sticking up on the top. If you get into a crash, that helmet, I think I've seen photos of you. You got yours on pretty good. But I've seen some where they're sitting up on the top and it's like a fashion statement. It's just there, but it's really serving no purpose. So make sure your helmet fits properly, covers your forehead, and you have about 2 finger space in between the chin strap.
All good points. All of them.
There's a nice 2-finger rule where like you don't want your helmet any higher than 2 fingers above your eyebrows, like here or lower. You want your straps to lay flat, like 2 fingers on your ear, not be like all twisted or janky, just because it's not going to be comfortable. And you can have up to 2 fingers here so that you're not choking yourself. That'll stay on. But just those 2 fingers, and keeping an eye on each other, and checking your buddies when they're being all fashiony about their helmets.
For sure, because it's all about looking good.
Yeah, check your helmets for cracks. Sometimes you may need to replace it at maybe 5 or 10 years, depends on if you're dropping it here and there. But yeah, you want to make sure your helmet's in good condition.
That is true. This is all good information. You guys are just a wealth of info. I'm going to have to circle back to you guys for another session. But Randy, you did mention something about tires, checking the tires. We will be having a session next Wednesday with Vittoria, and he's going to be running us through all things tires. I didn't know anything about tires until I spoke to this guy, Ken, and he's going to break down tires like I didn't even expect. So it'd be great if you guys can come back for that.
Yeah, different sizes, different air pressure, and things like that. Yeah.
All of it. Knobs, no knobs. Some are soft, some are gorilla style, tough.
Oh yeah.
I had no idea. I was like, is it rubber? I'll take it. That's about as far as I knew. So I'll close it out now. If you guys want to have any closing comments or remarks, or shout out folks to don't forget about this is what you can do, or any contact information or advice.
Well, when I think about advocacy, I think like we all have the opportunity to interrupt the stories that people have in their heads about who rides and why they should care about people who ride. The people who are selling bikes have told a story of who rides that doesn't look like most of us, and it is helpful when people remember that people that they love are out there on bikes. It changes how they feel about themselves as drivers. and it changes how they feel about, you know, wanting to support people that they care about and having safer communities. So just be sure and tell the great stories about why you ride, and the people who look like the people they love who ride.
You're right. It definitely changes the narrative when you make a connection with, it's not me, that guy, but it's actually your mom or your sister. So it definitely changes the narrative for certain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
and
you
just
so
get
much
out
for
there.
having us.
Yes, and just get out there and do something. You know, short miles, long miles, enjoy the ride.
For sure. Catherine, Randy, you guys have been extraordinary. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys doing this. It was a first, and you guys were the trailblazers, if you will, pun intended, to make this happen. I thank you guys sincerely for being a part of this, and I look forward to doing it again with you guys, maybe on a bigger platform, bigger scale, and maybe we have some Q&A with some visitors this time instead of it just being the quaint, intimate setting for just the three of us.
Thank
All right.
you.
So I will see you guys at the next session, and we'll take it from there.
All righty.
Peace.